Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples. We're coming back to work on our socialization lectures. We got just a couple more to get through this lecture series. Now today we're going to revisit an idea that we've actually talked about a little bit in the past. We've talked about socialization, and I want to make sure to refresh you on what we mean by socialization here. Socialization is a lifelong process through which we're learning the attitudes, values, and behaviors that are considered appropriate for members of a particular culture. In these last couple of mini lectures, we've talked about individual theorists that had ideas on the development of the self, concluding with the idea that much of what we consider to be us is really a social construct. It's kind of like my role of professor. Even though it's just a job, it's something that sticks with me 24 hours a day, whether that's responding to emails suddenly at 11 o'clock at night because I can't sleep, or thinking about my students and what's going on in their lives on a Saturday morning. It's just part of my identity. But it's also a social construct. I'm told how a professor is expected to behave, and I even interpret that myself as to how I think a professor should behave. We talked about the generalized other. I have other professors that I've worked in the past that are still in my head as role models, as guides, even some that have long passed this earth that are still sort of telling me about what it means to be a professor. Socialization is a lifelong process, and it sticks with us from the moment we're born to the moment we die. But there's a little bit more that I want to think about that. I want to talk a little bit about where we're getting this socialization from. And in the next lecture, I also want to talk a little bit about how we experience that socialization through the people around us. Now, first off, I want to talk about some expectations that are placed on us by something we call agents of socialization. Now, agents of socializations are very similar to the idea of institutions or social institutions. Institutions are the backbone of making sure that our society functions, and they included things like religion, politics, education, our families, social media, and more. Well, we also focus on agents of socialization because they play particular roles, often being part of social institutions, in shaping how we see the world. Now, agents of socialization are very important because as we age, they teach us socialization. They teach us how to behave. It kind of starts with your families. Our families socialize us in all sorts of things like how to behave in public, how to behave around other people, how to share, how to be nice, how not to be nice. They teach us silly things like how to wait in line, how to go fishing, how to ask permission. They ask us all sorts of things. Throughout our life, too, our families have input on us. Now, remember, we talked about George Herbert Mead and his idea that we experience different socialization over time. And our families definitely are part of our primary socialization. Things like teaching us how to talk, how to engage other people, what a conversation looks like, how we behave around other people, and more. Families are an important thing. Likewise, as we age, they tell us a lot about, well, how we're expected to behave. And often, where do they get this information? Wait for it. It's the same information that they were given when they were being socialized. Sometimes it just has a slightly different spin because, 20 or 30 years may have passed. But nonetheless, it's the same information that they were socialized to believe. This is one of the reasons, in fact, that so many of us have the same political and religious affiliations as our parents. And that's okay, by the way, but it's just something to think about. We often take on these ideas that we get from other people, and they took on those ideas because they got them from somebody else. It's just an extraordinary thing to think about how we as individuals are socialized, to think about our identities. Now, over time, this does change. Again, think about George Herbert Mead. As we age, we're expected to do more and more complex tasks, and education starts to play a role there. Education, something that's always stood out to me as a professor and as an educator and a teacher, I think is that we are often socializing our students really for one thing, and that's to be good workers. Think about it from your earliest days. We are socialized to raise our hand, to ask permission. We are socialized that we have to wait our turns, that we have to be quiet when people tell us to. At my school, the lunchroom had this really strange system where there was a box that was attached to three really big porch lights. And one was green, and one was yellow, and one was red. And you could kind of guess how those work in terms of us being allowed to talk. And it was so strange because the lights would just always be random colors and they didn't make sense. You never saw the light turn to green that meant that you could talk freely. It was always on yellow that you had to whisper when you talked. And suddenly it would just be flipped to red and they would scream, red light. And then you couldn't talk at all. And if you did, you got put at the timeout table and then you had to go to the principal. And it's interesting too, because they've also socialized us to believe, fairly so, that we are able to be penalized for the things that we do wrong, and that they have sway to put us at a table and tell us we have to sit there and eat our lunch alone, and that the principal is allowed somehow to give a formal sanction in writing us up, or an informal sanction in simply chewing us out, sending us back to class, socializing us for what's going to come for the rest of our lives. Our peer groups also play a role here. Now, peer groups are the people that you're friends with, but maybe even the people who are sort of the friends of friends, or even just the people around you at your school. But we get a lot of ideas about these people. In fact, they really are good at enforcing norms and the kinds of things that you're expected to value. So, for example, thinking back to high school, the things that I was taught to value are not the things that I at all value now. And yet I was really just valuing the things that were people around me telling me those were the things to value, like really cool cars. Yeah, okay, really cool cars are great, but now I'm just like, I'm fine driving my beat up car. And when I park it on campus and I get another ding in the door from someone parking too close next to me, it's all right. It's quite all right. In fact, I really can't tell which dents are the new ones and which one's the old ones now. It's life parking on a college campus, though. Our peer groups also give us a lot of ideas about things like sexuality, religion, things that we should believe, things that we don't believe, things that we should do, things that we shouldn't do. Like we're expected to impress certain people. Why? Well, that's just what our peer group would do. It's the old saying that my mom would say, if your peers jumped off a bridge, you'd probably follow them. Of course, the funny story is I probably would have been the one leading them in some cases off that bridge. Nonetheless, our peer group's yet again an agent of socialization, shaping how we see the world. Religion, also a very great example, because religion can give us so many of our beliefs and the things that we hold true. And here's the really interesting thing. They are infallible. They cannot be challenged. They are divine. They actually are a form of divine knowledge. They are not something that can be challenged. They are always held as true, and it doesn't matter what evidence is proven to the otherwise. They are things that are just unquestionable. In fact, people used to get kicked out of churches. It was called excommunication for questioning these things. People would even be killed in medieval times for questioning the beliefs of the church or saying crazy things like the world is round, or that we were the center of the universe, I specifically think. Nonetheless, religion is a very powerful thing, and it also gives us a lot of socialization about how we behave. And one of the big things that we find in many areas is that our churches are part of how we get our social networks. This is how we learn to know people, how we meet other people. In fact, for rural areas, we find that churches are a very important form of what we call social capital, something we'll bring up later in the semester, but it's simply the idea of a network of information, which might help you get everything from a job to a better grade in school because your teacher happens to go to the same church as you. These are important things. Throughout our life, we experience these kinds of socialization, and with time, certain ones play more important roles. Religion, particularly as we age, remains a very important one, where our families, our education, and our peer groups sometimes fall to the side. Mass media, however, is something that stays with us, and this goes into the realm of where we get the information that explains how we understand the world. Mass media is powerful because often, like religious values, it's something that we don't question. In fact, we get information and we either have a filter to say, well, this is probably reliable information, or we just don't have that filter and say, this is true. So-and-so on Facebook said it, so it must be true, which it probably wasn't if you got it from so-and-so on Facebook, because so-and-so on Facebook is really not a reliable source for pretty much everything. Nonetheless, this is something that's very powerful. And I have to say, too, as we're in a political election year, as I record this is especially powerful. People get so much of their information from mass media, and it's presented to them in an easily digestible soundbite. They don't really have to question it. They don't have to ask questions. They can just absorb it and repeat it and walk on. But throughout all of these agents of socialization, I feel like the whole point of this course is to learn to ask questions. In fact, we've been socialized often to feel we can't ask questions, but I'm here to tell you, you can ask questions, and moreover, you should ask questions. Think about the sociological imagination here. Think about how all of these things, as big ideas that are beyond us in our history, are shaping our individual experiences. Think about how the things that our families, our education, our peer groups, our religions, and certainly the mass media around us tells us about our reality and how that shapes how we think about us as individuals. The whole point of reflecting on socialization, I feel, is to really take a moment to ask who you are and to try to understand the decisions that are your decisions, your ideas, versus the ones that you've been given by others on silver platters. And as the saying goes, always be hesitant to trust things on silver platters. All right, that is going to wrap up this mini lecture. Now, in our next lecture, we're going to start focusing in on groups. And we'll also, too, in the near future, start thinking about roles and expectations that come from agents of socialization, amongst others, and how these impact how we see the world, and more importantly, how we see ourselves. If you have questions, if you need anything, you know where to find me. Reach out, and I'm happy to help. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next lecture. Take care.